Hey everyone, Matt from Colossal Books here. I did it. I finally did it. I finally finished Infinite Jest. For those of you who follow me, you know that I have been reading this book for what seems like a ridiculous amount of time, and to be honest, it was. I started this book June 1st, and I finished it about a week and a half ago. So late November, so it's been about half a year. I didn't take any breaks reading. Well, I took a 1-week break when I was defending my dissertation, so please forgive me. But I didn't take really any breaks reading this book. I read it basically every day. I read it very slowly, very deliberately, very carefully. And I kind of wanted to talk about my reading experience, what I took away from this book, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and what I recommend it. So I read this book as the kind of ongoing project of buddy reads with me and my cousin, where we kind of read all of the books we've always wanted to read, like the big books that are known for their difficulty and length and something maybe we don't have the courage to read by ourselves. So this time we picked Infinite Jest, and our original goal was to read it in 3 months, and it ended up taking us 6 months. So this book is by David Foster Wallace. This is his, I think, his second novel, but this is like the David Foster Wallace novel. Like, this is the one like that is synonymous with his name. He has a posthumous novel called The Pale King, and he had a novel beforehand called The Broom of the System. But this is the novel that gets all of the discourse following him. And yeah, it's a behemoth. It's enormous. It's 1,100 pages. It is by far the longest book I've ever read. And not only is it 1,100 pages, but let me show you something that gets kind of lost in translation through YouTube and stuff. Here's a normal sized book. This is Giovanni's Room. This is a normal sized paperback. And yes, it's much shorter, but when you stack these books up against each other, you see that it is also much smaller, like physically smaller, which means there is a lot of extra room for more text in this thing. So while this is, yes, 1,100 pages, and like a normal book is probably like 1,300 pages or something like that. There's also 100 pages of footnotes, and those footnotes are notorious for being long, like 20 pages sometimes, and the text of the footnotes, or the font of the footnotes, is much smaller than the font in the actual text. So sometimes you get to like a 20-page footnote, but really it's like 30 pages because the font is so small. Beyond the difficulty of this book, I feel like when people talk about what this book is about, I think they get wrapped up in maybe the wrong things, but understandably so. So I will very briefly touch on the plot really quickly, but I really think that there is more to this book than just the plot. While the plot is great and I love it, I really think summarizing what the plot is for this book kind of does the book a disservice, but I will try anyway. So there are 3 sub-narratives in this book. One, it follows an elite group of athletes in a tennis academy from grade school to high school. You follow one character in particular, one family really, the Incandenzas, or Hal Incandenza is like the main character. Hal struggles with addiction and kind of like his connection with other people and communicating his emotions and thoughts to other people. The other sub-narrative is about a halfway house that's just down the street from the tennis academy, and you follow this guy called Don Gately. He's this huge, monstrous guy who's very stoic, very to himself, and it's kind of just trying to find the meaning of life, trying to go through day by day and survive as a human being, basically. And there's actually a cool divergence or a cool parallel between these 2 characters, Don and Hal, where they're actually very similar and struggle with very similar things, but kind of they go through 2 different trajectories, which I won't talk about much more than that. You should read it for yourself. And the last one is about Quebec separatism. So in this book, the United States, Canada, and Mexico have formed one supercontinent. It's about some extremists from Quebec who are trying to basically separate from the supercontinent. It follows in particular this guy, Remy Marath. He is a part of a terrorist organization called the AFR, who are all wheelchair bound. And kind of his struggle with the meaning of being a terrorist and doing what he's doing and why he's doing it, and also his kind of friendship with a member of the United States kind of anti-terrorist organization, and how he kind of has this friendship with a character named Hugh Steepley, and they have kind of an interesting relationship. So that's the plot in a nutshell. But what I am gonna say here is that this book is like, it's much more than that. There are also people who say this book is about like addiction or boredom as a savior to all of your ongoing distractions. And certainly, yeah, it's about those things, but I even think it's much bigger than that. And what I'll say is, I think this book is about, it's about like everything, is a kind of a stupid way to say it. Let me say it this way. To be human is to be able to self-reflect, to be aware of yourself, be aware of your thoughts, your urges, and your pressures of everyday life. That's what being a human is. And having this kind of conscious thought, being able to talk to yourself. And this book exemplifies how that is the one thing that makes us human, but pretty much every human is trying to escape that feeling of self-awareness or neuroticism or anxiety, of just being aware. I think that this book is really just about how difficult, how immensely difficult, how ridiculously hard it is to be a human being, and how different people, I guess, cope with this mind-numbing pressure, this unbelievable pressure of being a human, of having humanity, of being conscious, you know? And this coping mechanism goes in several different ways. There are people who self-medicate and cope with drugs. There are people who cope with the meaning for life, you know what I mean? Characters who are like, if I can just get this one goal, then I have a meaning in life, and that's something to wake up to and try every day, or strive for every day. And there's people who go a completely different route and kind of just get lost within themselves and kind of become a shell of themselves because they can't really escape their head. These different ways of coping and dealing with this unbelievable pressure of just being a human being. And bless you. It's just kind of about these different methods, different coping mechanisms that these characters have for the overwhelming pressure and anxiety that comes with just being a conscious human being. So that's big, that's grand, right? That's a whole huge thesis that's kind of hard to get to. And I think that this book actually has a reputation for kind of the opposite, because that seems like a very sentimental, a very kind of empathetic narrative, right? I wrote a book that's basically about how difficult it is to be a person, you know? But it has this, okay, so if this book has such I guess empathetic purpose, why does it have this reputation for being overly difficult, obtuse, translucent, hard to get to? And I'll get to that in a little bit, but I do want to talk about the reading experience of this book. The first 50-ish pages they're amazing. It's you have this excitement, I am finally reading Infinite Jest, I'm finally doing it. And to be honest, the first 50 or so pages of this book are very captivating. They're very alluring. And, one of the only moments in this book where there's a first person perspective, that doesn't happen very often in this book. But after 50 or so pages, the magic of beginning Infinite Jest wears off pretty quick. In fact, I would say from pages 50 to 300, this book is a serious serious challenge. And it's a challenge for, not because like the writing is particularly difficult, which it is, it's difficult, it's dense, but really it's just a lot of information. It's a lot of information and it gets boring sometimes, or most of the time. And it's easy to find this part of the book overindulgent, over-intellectualized, too much, kind of coming off like DFW is just trying to show how smart he is, really, because there's just so much information in this book. Like, it's a mind-numbing amount of information, like from like the intricacies of like nuclear energy to like a 20-page passage about every tattoo that each character in the halfway house has, you know, to these classes these characters are taking and like what they're learning, to a game where these kids are playing tennis and they're basically sectioned off a tennis court as like the map of the world, and they're hitting tennis balls in sections of the map and pretend they're nuclear warheads, and like what are like the diplomatic and like worldwide consequences of hitting these nuclear warheads into these other areas. And he gives you all the minute details of all the like the rules of the game, and it's just a lot. Like, it's just a lot. And the way I kind of see it is that like it really reads like DFW like lived a lifetime in this world and has come back and feels like this driving urge to tell you every single detail he remembers from it. That's how it feels. And the writing style is pretty interesting in that way. Like, there's some beautiful, mind-blowingly gorgeous areas of prose, but there also are just like, here's a whole chapter about the architecture of the school. And I think that's what's so off-putting for a lot of people, is getting through this first 300 pages or so. But what I'll say is, like, after that, it gets much easier. It gets much better. It's because you've kind of like learned the bulk of the information of the universe it's in, the book takes place in. Layering on little bits of information are not as big of a deal. You know, you've kind of gotten past the big learning curve. And then you start to focus really on the characters. Because at this point in the book, the characters are kind of at like arm's length. They kind of act in weird ways or make decisions or are either addicted to something or have a vice. Don't know why they have, where it came from. You just know it's there. But this is the part of the book, like the 300 to 700-ish page range, where he kind of starts to fill that information out. And I like to think about them as like droplets of information, because they're not linear. You don't get it all at once, but he'll just do a little droplet of information about a character, about their backstory, about who they are. It's either done through exposition or a conversation with another character, but you pretty often don't get their direct thoughts. But I call it a droplet because it kind of adds to this small little pool, this small little cup of information you have for each character, and it expands as you get little drops of information. You find yourself really connecting or craving connection with these characters as you learn more and more about them, you know? And I think this is kind of like, once you've learned to give yourself to the writing style of the book, you can start to focus on learning more about these characters and learning what makes them tick. And you learn more about their backstory, and it's like, oh my God, no wonder he acts that way. No wonder they act that way because of this one thing that happened in their past. And it all connects. Like, it is all cohesive. There's not an inconsistency in this book. It's just like, the more you learn about a character, the more their behavior makes sense. But then when you start to learn more about these characters, you start to learn like, oh, well, this backstory totally explains why they act this way, you know? Like, these characters are so guarded from each other. There's oftentimes like a character will be desperately trying to communicate something to another character, but the person he's trying to communicate to just keeps cutting them off. Just keeps talking about what they want to talk about and not trying to connect. Almost like purposely trying to deflect connection with this other person. And it's incredibly frustrating, because when you read this, you're like, if you could just explain yourself to this other character, like your life would be easier. Connecting with these other characters would make your life easier because it would explain your behavior, and it would maybe, you wouldn't feel so alone. And that's the thing with these characters, is that they feel very tragic. They feel very tormented, and you only really get bits and pieces of information. Why? Partly because DFW doesn't tell you, but also mostly because the characters themselves don't like to talk about it. All these characters are putting on a front. All these characters are purposely being guarded and not acting or not saying what's on their mind or acting the way they actually feel. So when you get these portions in the book of real vulnerability from these characters, it is so rewarding. It feels so good because you get this guarded character for like 300, 400, 500 pages, that when you get this real raw emotion from them, it feels like I understand you. I understand why you feel the way you do, why you act the way you do, It's like kind of like an exercise in empathy, really. And patience and empathy. But you start to wonder, like, why are these characters so guarded? If like talking about their problems and connecting with other characters seems to be the answer, as DFW oftentimes I feel like is suggesting is the answer or is what they should do. How come they don't do it? Like, what is stopping them? Why is it so difficult to connect with other people and to be vulnerable in front of other people, And there's just kind of this interesting moment where the narrator, not Hal himself, is reflecting on this question. Like, if Hal really craves, or these characters really crave connection with other people, how come they always act so disaffected, so guarded, so apathetic about everything, when clearly the answer is vulnerability? And it's kind of this weird moment where it's like, well, actually, given everything in the world, like, can you really blame them for wanting to act disaffected? All these advertisements, all these distractions this way, going your way, disaffected artists who are older making art. And I guess this is kind of like a commentary on like postmodernism, that talk about how cool it is basically to be an apathetic, stoic person who doesn't talk about their emotions or be vulnerable with anyone. And people want to act cool because acting cool connects them with other people. But in this case, acting cool is acting more disaffected. So it kind of makes this cycle of like being less and less connected with each other and less vulnerable with each other. It's a very interesting meta moment. But like at the end of the day, like DFW kind of talks about this spectrum of coping, I suppose. One is you can give your brain like totally to distractions, whatever that distraction is, drugs, a purpose, whatever, right? Like you totally give yourself to this vice or whatever it is to distract yourself from this crushing weight of being human. Or you go in the other way where you become more and more and more withdrawn and more stuck within yourself. And that's kind of this balance between like infinite jest or infinite sadness, really. And kind of talking about how they both end badly, with like infinite jest, infinite distractions, like drugs. Obviously there's like an overdose, but he also talks about his purpose, where there are characters who have one purpose in life that once they finally get to that purpose, oftentimes they end up committing suicide or like finding no meaning in life, and life is purposeless anymore, And there's the other side of the spectrum where people become so reserved that they lose themselves, they lose their ability to connect to other people or physically communicate with other people. What DFW in this book, I think, is suggesting as, I guess, the answer is actually being vulnerable, being yourself, and connecting with other people. There are passages where there's one passage in particular I'm thinking of. Well, there's two really that I'm thinking about. One is like they're in this tennis camp, and it's afterwards, they've just finished practice, and all of the students are kind of being miserable together. They're just like, practice sucks, I hate this is terrible, our coach is an asshole, And afterwards, one of the younger characters talks to the main character, and he's like, like this negativity like really gets me down. Like, why are we so negative about our experiences here? And the main character is like, well, it's not really about the experience here. It's about the kind of connection and the camaraderie you have with your fellow, classmates. It kind of makes this whole thing worth it. It's like, it's how we get through it day to day, which is ironic because that's like what this main character struggles with the most, is connecting with other people. In fact, the other one is when kind of the main character is at like a breaking point, and he's so reserved, he's so quiet, that he finally just explodes. He finally lets it all out, kind of letting the emotions stumble over each other, and he's kind of venting to his brother, and he's expecting his brother to react poorly, but his brother is like, no, I think you did exactly what you needed to do, pretty on the nose, like, hey, I think this is like a solution to dealing with this crushing weight of being a person, is this connection with other people.
Hey, editing Matt here. I also just wanted to add that when you get to these moments of like mutual coping, mutual like connection as a means of distraction from like day-to-day life, they're just so warm and beautiful and amazing. There's like moments where it's like 5 a.m. and they're doing like tennis practice, but DFW goes to these little things that the characters do to kind of, get through it together. Like there's something they do, I think it's called atom crashing, where just to entertain themselves, they'll hit the tennis balls and purposely make them collide. Another thing I think about is Don Gately when he's making these meals for the people in the halfway house. He takes a lot of pride in making these meals for the people there, and he like worries about it when he can't make it. It's like, are people going to make it right? Do they know how to make these ingredients? And you kind of get these like really beautiful feelings of community, even though they're unlikely community, even though they're communities that on paper don't make sense. Like you get these really beautiful moments of like suffering together, togetherness as a means of getting over this day-to-day struggles.
And quickly, there's one moment I'm also thinking about. There's a moment where one of the characters is in the hospital and he's visited by someone, like one of his friends who he has maybe an interest in, and it just feels so warm. It is such a beautiful passage because you have this character who's like so stuck within himself. He's so secluded and insulated in his own world that he has someone who comes in and displays genuine desire to connect. It is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. It's like moving, it's beautiful. I've read it like a dozen times at this point, and it's just one of the most, like, there's so much payoff in this book, so much like literary payoff is the best way I can say it. Lastly, there's one which is like pretty funny, where the main character, he's very withdrawn, like I said. He's reflecting on this idea of like, why can't I communicate with other people, or what is making me stop communicating with other people? And to do it, even though he's like really craves it, and to do it, he kind of goes into this film room, which is unlocked. He knows it's unlocked. He knows everyone has 24/7 access to it. And he sits there and he's watching a movie, and then throughout the movie, more and more people come in. And he keeps acting like, oh, I don't want people to come in here, or like, oh, I don't care about this movie or what you guys think about the movie. When everyone else is connecting and having a great time, talking and making jokes and, having a good time, like coping with this existence, but he's just sitting there in the corner, like acting too cool to do it, when he was just reflecting on how badly he needs it, how badly he needs to connect with people. Like there's such a wall between him and everyone around him. And it's funny because he clearly went into this room and put on a loud movie to get other people's attention, and once he gets it, he's reluctant to talk. It talks about how hard it is to connect with people and how hard it is to be a person. And that's when I kind of want to go back to like the writing style. Like I said, like if this is a book that has such an empathetic message of just like be vulnerable and sincere with each other and connect with each other, why do people think it's such an unapproachable, like standoffish, over-intellectualized purposely inaccessible book? Well, partly it's funny because like you listen to DFW talk, if you listen to his interviews, this is how, like, the way he writes is how he talks. Like, he adds all the information he can fit into a sentence, and you can feel like he has this neuroticism of like not being able to leave information out when he talks. And one of his fears, and if you go listen to this interview with him and this Michael Silverblatt of the Bookworm podcast, or I guess then it was like a radio show, he says that like one of his biggest fears is writing something that people will think is overly difficult, you know, that is inaccessible on purpose. And it makes me think about how vulnerable it must be to write the way he does when that's his biggest fear. Like, this is just the way I talk and think and speak, as neurotic as I am, and I'm just gonna put it out there. You know, I'm just gonna be who I am in front of everyone here, even though I risk people thinking my biggest fear about me, which is that I'm an inaccessible person, you know? And that one, to me, when the whole thing kind of came together, was like, this book itself, the writing of this book, is his like exercise in preaching, or in practicing what he preaches, right? Like practicing this vulnerability, practicing like being sincere. This book is written in his voice, as like with no filters, right? Just him being as himself as he possibly can. And he's running the risk of seeming overly intellectual when that's just kind of how he thinks and talks. And the whole point of the book is to be yourself, and who he is being someone who over intellectualizes things, you know? I don't know if that made sense, but to me it was like, holy shit, this is one just big exercise in what this book is actually about. And on top of that, he also talks about other things that, like, if you can't get that connection with other people, how do you sit with yourself and deal with, again, the crushing weight of being a human? And there's a really cool moment with his character. I don't want to say the character, I don't want to spoil it, but he does this thing called abiding, where each second of the day of turmoil, of torture, is not undeal-withable. Like, they're all endurable, is what I'm trying to say. Each second of the day is endurable, no matter how much pain you're going through, how much, you know, turmoil you're going through. Each individual section in a vacuum is endurable. The thing that makes it difficult is this endless stacking of sentences throughout your life that becomes unendurable and that overwhelming, right? But he's kind of presenting this method of take it like second by second, because each second is totally endurable, and abide in each second, basically. Like, just deal with each second as it comes. And it really reminds me of this book where each sentence or each word is not unendurable, but it's kind of this idea of having so many words that fills up 1,100 pages is what becomes overwhelming. So not only is this book like, how do people deal with this pressure of being human, he also kind of like provides like answers, you know? He kind of provides an answer where one of it is like connection with people, and the other one is like, if you can't connect with people, you can't enroll with people, learn to sit with yourself, learn to sit and abide second by second by yourself, you know? I mean, at the end of the day, it really grew on me. It really, to me, struck out as like a book where you had someone really trying to communicate something positive, you know? And, you know, over 1,100 pages, it becomes a very personal experience, you know? Like, I spent a half an hour to an hour with this book every day for a half a year, you know? And like I said, this book is just like life. There are amazing, brilliant moments. There are moments where it's just a slog, and this book becomes a very personal thing, something you spend an intimate time with your life. An hour a day for a significant portion of your life is going to become very intimate, and you're going to take a lot of things that are very personal to you out of the book. As everything started tying together at the end, and all these threads started to come together at the end, and as the message becomes more and more clear and more realized through the characters, like Don Gately in particular, the book becomes more warm, more welcoming, and you just want to get back to it and read more and more, to the point that when I finished this book, even though the first like 50% of this book I did not enjoy, the first thing I did when I closed the book was open it up and start again. And I read like the first 30 or 40 pages all over again. Yeah, so I would say a pretty amazing book, pretty amazing experience. Is this book perfect? Hell no. Absolutely not. It's so long. I mean, statistically, doing a perfect book for 1,100 pages straight is not probable, not likely. If you let someone into your brain, like he's giving us access to his brain 100%, there's gonna be stuff in there that's not quite nice. In particular, to this day, like this book, it has a lot of racism in it. And I know like the DFW fanboys are gonna raise their pitchforks every time this comes up on like Reddit or something. People try to shoot it down with the argument that you can be a not racist person and write about racist characters. Of course, I think that's true. Of course, I think that is possible. However, I don't think that's the case with this book. There is not a person of color or a non-white person in this book that is treated in a positive light at all. And I understand that the narrative kind of reflects, or the narrator kind of reflects who is being discussed in the book. So like when you're talking about like if it's a Hal who's being discussed, the narrator is kind of reflecting what he thinks. So you kind of are getting reflections of like other people based on who you're reading about. But there is not a single positive reflection on a person of color or a minority in this book. It's all negative. He does not write a redeeming aspect about any person of color or minority in this book, to the point where it goes beyond like, these are just racist characters. It's like this is kind of probably the only thing that DFW himself has reflected about these characters. And then again, you go into that horrible essay he wrote about standard white American English, and then uses like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, kind of like how conservatives on Twitter use MLK. Like it's pretty disgusting, honestly, in my opinion. So that's part of it. I also do think it does get bloated at times. Like there are some times you read it, you're like, okay, that really didn't need to be discussed. With that being said, do I think this book is worth the read? Would I recommend this book? Worth the read, absolutely. I loved this book. By the end of this book, I absolutely adored it. I still am picking it up, reading passages out of it day to day, thinking about it pretty much every day since I finished it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful book with a really beautiful message. But would I recommend it to someone? That's a tougher question. I have recommended it to my brother because I think he'd really like it, but it's not a book I would just recommend to someone. In fact, if you just want to get the messages that DFW says, he probably does a better job describing the messages he wants to say through his nonfiction or through his essays. You could read his essays and get everything he wants to say, everything he means to say in this book through his essays, and probably more clarity. I guess it's really, do you want to have like a really intimate experience over a long period of time with a piece of art, you know? Like, do you want to spend the time and kind of abide in this book and kind of leave with like a personal experience? That's up to you if you want that or not. I think that if you stick through it, take your time with it, and don't kind of zoom through it, like really think about what you're reading, I think most people will enjoy this book. But to me, it was nice to read a book that was very, by the end, very human, you know? And that's what I'd say. I'd say this book is incredibly human. Okay, I hope any of this made sense. I've been talking for 40 minutes. I wrote down kind of what I wanted to say, but you guys know me, I get sidetracked. But yeah, beautiful book, human book. It speaks on what it means to be human. and I will probably actually reread it at some point in my life, unfortunately. And to answer the question, is it shaped like a Sierpinski casket? I reluctantly and regrettably say yes. Yes, it is, which is so annoying. I love you guys. I will talk to you in the next video. Should be next weekend or the weekend after that. I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you so much for watching if you made it this far, and if you haven't, whatever, I appreciate it anyway. Okay, and I'm going to show you my cats. They're cuddling right now. This is kind of like a new thing for them, so